Hello listeners, this talk is about my recent trip to Australia. I returned to Taiwan about a week ago now. It seems like much longer, but it was only a little over a week ago. So I'm going to talk about some of my observations and my reflections upon that trip. I'll begin by talking about the good things, and then I'll move on to the bad things, and then I'll talk about general sort of feelings and so on that I have about Australia and how I see myself relating to all of that. So the good things. First of all, I managed to meet up with some people through my YouTube channel when I was in Australia. In fact, I actually met one guy just before I went to Australia, an Australian who came over to Taiwan, and we met up and had a bit of a chat for several hours, and that was only a couple of days before I went to Australia. And then when I got to Australia a couple of days later, I met up with someone else, and then towards the end of my trip to Australia, I met up with a third person via my channel, and that was really good meeting those three guys. They're all very intelligent and interesting, and I think we talked for approximately 4 or 5 hours in each case, though I think we could have talked for a lot longer, and hopefully I'll see those guys again in the future. So that was really good, and it was really sort of uplifting and energizing as well to meet some very interesting and intelligent people. Sometimes it feels a little bit like I'm in an echo chamber, or as I'm quite isolated in many ways. So that was really good. And also, one of my friends in Australia, one of my long-term friends, he sort of revealed to me that he's a bit of an edgelord. Actually, I don't think he's as much of an edgelord as I am, or other people I know through my channel are. But he does have some pretty politically incorrect views on all sorts of things. Though he said to me, of course, he can't tell anyone these things because he could lose his job and all of that sort of stuff. I had suspected for a while that he was this way, because every so often I would post something on Facebook, and then a week later or something he would send me a private message with a link to a particular news story or something like that. I don't think he follows any explicitly alt-right or neo-reactionary blogs or YouTube channels or anything. The stuff he sends me is always sort of mainstream news and that kind of thing. But I might start drip feeding him some of this stuff. Actually, I might start him on some Moldbug and get him going from there. He's kind of a libertarian guy, but he has some sort of more right-wing views than that. So it's kind of interesting learning that about him. As I said, I'd already suspected it for a while, but he confirmed it. So that was interesting. And actually, he and I went out to see a band that was really good in Australia. I'd seen them before; he'd never seen them before. So that was really good too. Now, the next set of good things. The rural part of Australia. I spent a fair bit of time in rural Victoria. Victoria is one of the states of Australia in the southeast, and it's the state where Melbourne is. It's the second most populated state in Australia, though it's quite a small state by land area. So I spent a fair bit of time in rural Victoria, and as always, it was really beautiful. It was gorgeous, actually, walking around and driving around in rural Victoria. So that was really nice. And actually, all of my encounters with people, all of my social interactions there were really positive. I mean, in some parts of rural Australia, there are a fair number of lower class people, white people, who can be a bit sketchy at times. But I didn't have any encounters with those kinds of people. All of the people I met in shops and so on were all pretty nice, actually. It's really, really nice. And they tend to be a lot more laid back than people in the city. They're not really in your face and sort of curt and that kind of thing. So that was really nice. And following on from that, there is a lot of social capital and social trust in the countryside, a lot more so than in the city. For instance, My parents, they have a small holiday house in a very small town in rural Victoria. There are only a couple of hundred people in that town, and a fair number of them are people like my parents who own holiday houses there. But nevertheless, my parents know their neighbours there. They know the people on either side and across the street. So there's all sorts of social trust there that's really nice. Because my parents are only there 50% of the time, so they sort of spend a week there, a week in Melbourne, a week there, a week in Melbourne, and so on and so forth. Sometimes they're not there when the lawn needs to be cut, or when certain things need to be put out to be collected, because they collect different types of rubbish at different times, different weeks, and so on. The local council up there, so their neighbours take care of those things for them, and have done so even before they even got to know them. I think when they'd only been up there a short while, they came up one time and their lawn was mowed. And another time they came up and their bins had been put out and returned to where they keep their bins near the front of their house. The neighbours just did that for them because they knew they weren't there, and that those things needed to be done. So that's a really nice thing that people do that. And so when I was at their holiday house, I cut the lawn one day, and I just said to my dad, should I cut the neighbour's lawn on either side? Because they weren't there. On one side, that they've actually moved out. They've moved around the corner to a bigger property, and they're preparing that place to rent it. And on the other side, there's just a guy who lives there, and he wasn't there for some reason, an old guy. So I said to my father, should I cut their lawn on either side? And my father said, yeah, just do that. That'd be good, because they always do it for us. So I did that. And people do all sorts of stuff like that up there. So my parents have a wood fire there, and so they get wood whenever they can find wood. You can get wood sometimes if it's by the side of the road or that kind of thing. So they get wood whenever they can. They try not to pay for it if they can avoid it. So my father had a whole lot of wood there, and he has a wood splitter, one of those hand-operated ones. You plug it into the wall, but it's not that powerful. And usually when I'm up there, we split a whole lot of wood together. But some of the wood was too dense. It was really hard wood. The last time I was there, not the time just gone, but the time before that, and so we couldn't really do it with his machine. So the guy across the street just came over. I think this was after I'd left. He came over with his own machine and said, I'll just do it for you. And he did it. He had a really powerful machine. So people just do that. They just come over and they, if they see that you need something done and you can't do it, then they just do it for you. And that's really nice, actually, that feeling of social capital and social trust where everyone just sort of looks after each other is really cool. And I really like that town too. Just walking around the town in the late afternoon, there were a whole lot of people just kind of hanging out. There were some guys doing some cricket practice, and some people had been swimming and all sorts of stuff. They have all these sporting clubs up there, and people just kind of hang around. And so it's, we just sort of walk past them and they'll say hi to you and all of that sort of stuff. And one other story along the lines of sort of social capital and social trust that doesn't exist in the city is across the road there's another property, and it's quite a large property. It's an acreage, and it sort of goes around onto another street as well. And the part that comes onto the street where my parents have their house is just part of the acreage. The house is up the other end, sort of around the corner. And they have horses there. They have 3 horses. And sometimes if the horses are close enough, we sort of try to entice them over with carrots or apples or something to feed these horses. But we were walking one day, my wife, my kid, and I were walking, and we saw one of the horses. We recognised the horse. It was kind of near the entrance around the corner to that property. And there was a little girl. She was probably about 9 years old. She was walking the horse. So we just went up to her and said, can we pat your horse? And we just started talking to this little girl. And she was really just kind of open. She was just talking to us about her horse and so on. That's not really something that would happen in the city. People would be too paranoid that you're going to kidnap their kid or something like that. And kids wouldn't talk to you like that. So there's another kind of nice thing there. If people are really trusting and almost naive in some ways. I really liked that feeling that everyone's sort of in a community and they just implicitly trust each other. So that was pretty cool. In contrast, Melbourne is not like that at all, and that's something that increasingly frustrates me about going back to Melbourne. So I'm going to get on to the bad points now. I mean, there were a lot of good points actually in there, but they were sort of fairly mundane, just driving around or walking around thinking, wow, that's really beautiful there, that place, look at that view, that kind of thing. But it's pretty mundane to sort of talk about that stuff. I did really enjoy it. But anyway, I'll get on to the bad points now, or at least some sort of odd observations at first. So one of the first things I noticed, and I've noticed this before, but I was really aware of it this time, is the men in Australia and the women as well. But the men, there's this sort of strange masculinity in Australia that I've noticed. It's framed in a very particular, sanctioned, sanitized way. So guys that are big. I mean, I'm tall, but I'm not a big guy. I'm sort of pretty average. At least for a 40-year-old, I could probably do to lose a little bit of weight, but I'm okay for a 40-year-old. But guys in Australia are huge. A lot of guys go to the gym, big guys, and a lot of them have tats as well. And obviously not every guy who is big is going to be as I'm about to describe. But I've noticed this weird sort of thing where I suspected that and some associated things like guys being really into the football and that kind of stuff, watching football. Or sometimes you'll even see them in the park playing football. These middle-aged guys kicking a football, not necessarily even with kids, but amongst each other. Something I've noticed about that is it seems like a safe outlet or a safe expression of masculinity, because I've noticed that a lot of guys, and it's not all guys, but a lot of guys in Australia are actually, they're sort of caricatures in that way, because when you see them interacting with their wives or girlfriends or with their kids, they're completely under the thumb of anyone else in their lives. And again, this is not every guy in Australia, but tons of guys. And I really noticed it this time with my brother-in-law, or not my brother-in-law, I guess he's my cousin's husband, so whatever that is, cousin-in-law or something. We went over to my cousin's house, and this guy, he's kind of a big guy. He's not tall, but he's big, and he has sleeve tattoos and all of this sort of stuff. He's a big guy. He works in a blue-collar job, but he also goes to the gym. He's a big guy. But everyone walks all over him. It's incredible. It's like out of one of those American sitcoms where the husband is this sort of lovable doofus who sort of shakes his head and says, "Oh, okay, yes, dear." And the wife just kind of walks all over him. His wife, my cousin, she just henpecks the hell out of him. And if he has an opinion, he has to sort of run it by her first. But in particular, I was watching him interact with his kids. So he has 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. And the boys, I think they're about 9 and 5, 9 and 6, something like that. And these 2 boys, they were in the back. We were in the backyard, and we're all sitting around, a whole bunch of adults, my cousins and my aunt and my parents and so on. We were sitting in the backyard eating some food and talking, and the 2 boys had a soccer ball, and they're kicking this soccer ball around in the backyard. And my cousin's husband kept saying, "Okay, stop doing that." Because they kept kicking this ball, and every time they kicked it, it went into these bushes. He had just planted all of these small bushes in the garden. He'd just sort of done the whole backyard area, and he had planted a row of these bushes, and every time these boys kicked this ball, it tore into these bushes, and several leaves and probably some small twigs and branches as well fell off these bushes. They were destroying these bushes, and he kept saying, "Come on, don't do that. Don't do that." And they just kept doing it. And he's like, "I'm going to take the ball away." So they kept doing it for about 10 minutes. So finally he said, "All right, come on, give me the ball." So one of them came over. After he said that multiple times, "Give me the ball," about 5 minutes later, one of them finally came and gave him the ball. And then the other one just went and got another ball and just started kicking that around. They continued doing that again for another 10 or so minutes. The whole time I was just sort of watching this, and he was sort of pleading with them, "Come on, someone please take me seriously." And I see this all the time in Australia. These guys who they have this kind of outlet of masculinity, like they work out or they watch the football or something like that. But their wives, girlfriends, children, everyone around them, bosses, anyone, they walk all over them. It's really it's sort of perplexing to me. Um, and further to this, the other thing I've noticed about men and women in Australia is it's almost the inverse of what you see in some other countries. So some of you may have noticed this or been to these places, but if you go to Eastern Europe and also in some parts of Asia, you'll see guys who look pretty shabby. They're quite out of shape, or they look like they've just come off a 3-day bender or something like that. And they have a woman who is clearly out of their league physically. She looks like a supermodel, and this dude just looks like Boris Yeltsin. And you think, what's going on there? Well, it's kind of the inverse of that in Australia. You have these guys who obviously put tons of effort in. They go to the gym. They're big guys. They can lift a lot, and you can see it. You can see just by looking at them. And they do their hair and all this sort of stuff, right? And they dress relatively well. So you see these guys, and then they have these girlfriends or wives who frequently don't put any effort in, and they're overweight. They wear tracksuit pants or slippers or whatever, like really sort of low key gear, and their hair is there's this particular hairstyle in Australia that women have, younger women, sort of anyone under the age of 35, where they sort of put their hair up in a kind of a bun or ponytail on the top of their head, but it's all sort of, they don't comb it when they do it. It's all sort of, it looks really scraggly and scrappy, and they look like they've just got out of the shower, or like they've just got out of bed or something, with their hair and these sort of slack clothes that they wear, and they're kind of overweight. They see these women who are sort of like a 4 out of 10 or a 5 out of 10, and it's quite common, with a guy who in any other country would be a 7 out of 10, and you think, what's going on there, right? It's a really strange phenomenon that I've noticed in Australia. It's extremely noticeable, actually, more so than in other countries where, in the West, where there's not as much of a disparity between the men and the women. The guys in Australia seem like they really put an effort in and all of that. And it's sort of, it's a strange reaction, and their masculinity is channeled into very particular avenues. But, everyone in their lives walks all over them. It's quite a strange thing, actually. So that's something I noticed about Australia this time. Well, I've noticed it before, but it was really prominent this time. And actually I noticed it last time when I went to Queensland. It seems even more pronounced in Queensland. The guys there are enormous. And the women are enormous too, but not, you don't want your woman to be enormous. So yeah, that's something I noticed. Another sort of people watching thing that I noticed in Melbourne this time is, I don't know whether I was walking around with my eyes closed or not, or whether it's just the past 6 months, but there are Indians, dot not feather, everywhere now in Melbourne. I'd noticed a few before, but this time it was really startling. They were everywhere in Melbourne. I don't know what's going on there. Huge numbers of Indians, and to a lesser extent Chinese, though I think a lot of the Chinese are tourists. I mean, I saw big tour groups and I could sort of understand some of the stuff they're saying and kind of listen to them a little bit. When I was walking around in the city, I knew that they were tourists, those guys, and I could tell by their accents and so on that they were Chinese, not Taiwanese. But I really noticed a lot of Indians this time. I don't know what's going on there. Now, another thing about Melbourne actually is sort of really unattractive to me now. It sort of really did my head in this time. I mean, there's still a lot of really good things about Melbourne. It does have a lot of beautiful things. I went to the Botanic Gardens and walked down by the river, the Yarra River, and so on. So there are still a lot of really nice things about Melbourne. But the trouble is that the population density is going through the roof in Melbourne. They seem to be building enormous numbers of high-rise buildings in the city and extending outwards now from the inner city, the central business district, just extending outwards from there. Enormous numbers of high-rise buildings and even sort of medium density buildings apartment blocks that aren't skyscrapers and so on, but still have a lot of people on them. That seems to be a real thing in Australia now, and it's spreading. And so the population density is insane. So even though there's still those nice things, the trouble is that there are hordes of people everywhere you go now. So even in places like the Botanic Gardens, if you go there, during the afternoon, on a weekday, there are still tons of people there. And it seems to be the case everywhere. And anywhere that's sort of remotely close to the city now just has hordes and hordes and hordes of people, wall-to-wall people everywhere. And likewise with traffic. The traffic this time, it's been getting on my nerves more and more each time I've gone back for the past couple of years. But the traffic is just out of control in Melbourne now. In one particular instance, I had to travel from my parents' house, which is in a sort of inner city suburb, to another inner city suburb on the other side of the city. There's no good way to get there. You can go through the city, or you can sort of skirt around the edge of the business district, but they're equally as bad. So the entire journey was under 15 kilometres. I think it was probably about 12 kilometres, something like that. It took me an hour and a half to drive there on a Saturday afternoon. I couldn't believe it. I really couldn't believe it. It was just insane. There were a number of times when it took me 3 cycles of the traffic lights to get through an intersection. It was absolutely insane. Wall-to-wall traffic all the time. I think I probably spent more time stationary at traffic lights than actually moving between traffic lights. I couldn't get over it. And I thought, how do people do this on a daily basis? Like on another occasion, we came back from where my parents have their holiday house to Melbourne, and my parents try to travel during particular times when they do that so that they don't get the main traffic. And so we hit Melbourne about 2:30 in the afternoon, which shouldn't be a busy time, but the on-ramps and off-ramps for the freeway were banked up way back in each case, and I thought, grief, that's not during the peak travelling times in the morning or the late afternoon, early evening. I thought, I don't know how people do this on a daily basis. And actually, one of the guys I met through my channel, he was telling me that they estimate that, or they're trying to get the population of Melbourne up to about 7 million by 2030. Now, to put this in perspective, when I was a teenager, the population of, so this was sort of the early 90s, right? So it was about 20 years ago approximately. The population of Australia Melbourne was a little over 3 million. I think it was about 3.1, I'm not sure. It's now 4.4 million. And so they're talking about within another, 14 years, adding another 2.6 million people to the population of Melbourne. So, what's that as a percentage? Let me just do that. They're talking about adding another 59% of the population to Melbourne. Its current population plus another 59% of that within not even a generation. I can't believe that they're going to do this. And I read something recently, just a couple of days ago, that they estimate that the population of Melbourne will be something like 9 million by 2050. So within my lifetime, from going from a teenager to being an old man, Melbourne's population will have tripled in that time. That's insane. I don't know how they're going to manage it with transportation. And actually, that guy I met, he also told me that supposedly by 2030 there'll be 1 million people travelling into the central business district every day for work. 1 million people. I don't know how they're going to manage that, whether it's driving or by public transport, because the public transport in Melbourne's pretty terrible, and the cost to upgrade that into dealing with the public sector, the unions and so on. I don't know how they'd be able to manage that volume of people. It's just crazy. To me, it seems like it's out of control at the moment. But the thing about this is, it's driven, a large part of it's driven by immigration, obviously. And one of the things about immigration to Australia is that these people coming to Australia, the majority of them are from Asia. So those people are used to very high population densities in their own countries. So it's nothing new to them. And in some cases, they actually like it. They don't like being in sparsely populated areas. But the other thing is that even if they want something that's sort of more laid back than where they're from, they didn't see Melbourne when it had 3 million people. They only see it now when it has 4.4 million people. And I don't know what the population density is, but it's still a lot lower than it is in major cities in Asia. And so for them, that's actually an improvement. Even though, from my point of view, it's getting worse, I can see it getting worse. They didn't see it back then. They only see it now, and that's still an improvement. Even though it's worse than before, that's still an improvement for them. And so, they're not as aware of this issue, or they don't even see it as an issue because it's an improvement for them. And in the meantime, the locals, some of them are starting to complain about access to property and the strains upon infrastructure and so on. But a lot of people are making money, on paper at least, through real estate. And so they're kind of all for it. They've made all this money. My cousin, the one I mentioned before with the husband who's under the thumb, when we were over there and I talked to her, she couldn't stop talking about how much money they've supposedly made on their property and, what they could do with that money and all of this sort of stuff. So, that's sort of the devil's bargain. Everyone in Australia or significant portions of the population have been bought off with paper wealth or with consumer goods. And this is another thing that I'll get onto, consumerism. Consumerism is just out of control in Australia. The stuff people waste money on is unbelievable. I'll talk about this a little bit in a second. But there's been this bargain with the devil in Australia that people have this illusion of prosperity. They have all the material trappings of, new shiny things, new me phones and all these other things, and being able to go overseas to Bali or Vietnam or something for a holiday each year. They have all the trappings of prosperity that their grandparents didn't have. But their grandparents didn't have to spend an hour and a half in traffic to get to work. Their grandparents had parks and gardens that weren't wall-to-wall people. Their grandparents had functional schools and universities and all of these sorts of things. The public infrastructure and the actual real components of a quality of life, they had those things. They could spend time with their families. They had a nice living environment, a low-stress living environment, and so on. All of these things, these are the true things, the real things that give you quality of life. And these things are slipping away. These things are deteriorating. They're falling off a cliff, actually. They're not deteriorating. They're falling off a cliff in places like Melbourne. It's more and more noticeable each time I go back, and it really breaks my heart. Because for me now, Melbourne is kind of nothing. I don't think I'll ever live in Melbourne again. Unless I somehow had tens of millions of dollars and I could, own a really amazing place in a really nice part of Melbourne, I would not want to live kind of in the suburbs. This is the pact, the devil's pact that people have made. They've got new shiny stuff. They've got their fleeting pleasures, but the real things that make up their standard of living and their heritage, all of these things that were built by previous generations, these are being squandered and they're slipping away from them. Some people are beginning to notice this and complain about this, but of course a lot of those people also, they're not going to be anti-immigration. Immigration is a large part of the problem because you can't just keep adding millions of people to Melbourne. I mean, that's not coming from natural births, right? The fertility rate in Australia, and particularly in the capital cities, is very much sub-replacement. So it's not coming from births, it's coming from immigration. And this is something that Australia is going to have to address. Because even when the immigration is it's not Dindu immigration, it's, in many cases, the people are smarter, wealthier, better educated and so on than the locals. And those things present their own set of challenges in terms of out-competing the locals. But even leaving all that aside, these people aren't coming over and committing crime and so on, but it's just the population density and all of the second and third order effects that come out of that. That's what's happening in Melbourne, and it's each time I go there, it's a place that I like to visit for some of the things like the Botanic Gardens and things like that, or to go and see bands or that kind of stuff. The cultural attractions. But as a place to live or work, I think you'd have to tie me to several strong horses and drag me kicking and screaming to actually want to experience that side of being in Melbourne. It's a tragedy. Now, onto the issue of consumerism. I'm just blown away at the money that sort of sloshes around in the Australian economy, and I don't really know where it comes from, because the average person in Australia has a sort of a make-work, pen-pushing, paper-shuffling job. I don't quite know what they really do. I mean, I know what they do, but how does that actually make any real money? How does that actually make any real prosperity? It's just like if I give you $1 and then you give me $1, and then I give you $1 and you give me $1, there's all this economic activity, but nothing has actually happened, really. And that seems to be what's going on there. But people, there's been this massive real estate boom. There's this huge bubble, and so people are sort of cashing in on that, I guess. A lot of people are locked out of that. But nevertheless, I'm just blown away by what people spend money on. Whenever I go there, I try to go to second-hand stores, charity stores. They're called opportunity shops in Australia. So I try to go to these places and get books in particular, because English books are quite expensive and not so easy to get where I live in Taiwan. So I go over there and I get a hold of these second-hand books and bring them back here for my son. And it's incredible. A lot of these books, I didn't pay more than $3 for a book. Most of them, I'd say the overwhelming majority, I think I bought about 100 books, kids' books. The overwhelming majority were 50 cents. And, you turn them over, you look at the sticker on the back. In many cases, they still have the sticker from the shop where they were bought new. And, they're $14, $15, and they're 50 cents in the op shop. But in many cases, they'd never been opened. Like when I opened the pages, I bought a whole lot of those board books, those sort of thicker cardboard ones that little kids won't tear. And when I opened them, they sort of creaked because it was the first time they'd been opened. Each page sort of made a creaking sound. And in other cases, there were some that had some sort of little activity things, stickers or things, stencils and this kind of stuff. They were still wrapped in plastic. They'd never been opened. And I picked them up for a couple of dollars. It's incredible. And you go into those stores and they have anything you can think of, clothing, furniture, anything that you could find in your house, appliances, dishes, books, DVDs, you name it. Anything and everything there. And we went into one of these stores and I saw a lounge suite. It was a little bit old, the style of it, but it looked like it was in perfect condition, because a lot of these stores, they don't accept anything that's not in pretty close to perfect condition, particularly in the better suburbs, the wealthier suburbs. They'll just reject anything that doesn't look really good. So we went into one store and I saw a lounge suite that was $65. $65. That's 65, not a large number, $65 for a couch. It wasn't a full lounge suite, it was just a couch. And then there was an armchair that was $15, $15. And similar things for anything else you could think of in that store. It's incredible. And people are just going out and buying all this new stuff all the time, just, blowing money on crap. Because there's this illusion of prosperity in Australia. Because there's this huge housing bubble, and people use their houses as an ATM. There hasn't been a proper recession in, I think it's about 25 years now, something like that. It was the early 90s. Australia sort of dodged all of those other things. They dodged the GFC in Australia. So, whereas other countries had to sort of sort these things out, the money has sort of continued unabated. The mining boom is coming to a close now, and who knows what's going to happen with this housing bubble. Although I think that will just continue because they'll just keep bringing in lots of wealthy Chinese essentially to prop it up, and they're supposed to only buy new developments, but they have their ways around that. And actually, when I was at Melbourne Airport coming through passport control coming into Australia, on just sort of over to my left, there was a family, a Chinese family, and there was a kid. He was probably about 11 years old, and he was talking to the passport control agent. His family couldn't speak English, and he had an Australian accent, a flawless Australian accent. So I gathered that probably what had happened was he had been sent to Australia to live with relatives, and he was kind of the first step in the family moving over. And the passport agent was saying to him, are any of you guys citizens? Maybe the kid was, I don't know, but the parents certainly weren't. And the kid said, no, we've bought a house here, but we haven't moved here yet. We're not residents either. We're just moving here now. Something like that. And the agent said, well, I can only give you sort of the basic tourist entry visa or whatever. I don't know what the exact situation was. But, you have these people who just come over here like that. They buy stuff through their relatives, or one of them moves over for a few years and probably eventually gets citizenship, and then that's kind of the in, right? That's the foot in the door. So I think that's just going to continue, and that will probably prop up the housing bubble. But of course, a lot of people will be locked out of that. But I just can't fully wrap my head around how Australians just spend money on all sorts of stuff. I mean, if you go out anywhere to eat, or if you go out for drinks or anything like that, everything's expensive. It's unbelievably expensive in Australia for everything. And I just can't sort of grasp where this money is really coming from, and how Australia is going to ultimately remain competitive. I think I discussed in a recent talk about the median salary. I think it's $21 US per hour, something like that. I can't see how Australia is going to be able to continue to compete against other Western nations, let alone other nations, and maintain this level of prosperity. And that's it. The prosperity, as I've already mentioned, is only surface level, because the true things about standard of living are all slipping away. Everyone's in wall-to-wall traffic. They don't spend time with their families, all of that kind of stuff, but they have nice new shiny things, and overseas holidays. So that was sort of another observation. And the last thing, talking specifically about these observations, was Melbourne Airport, Tullamarine Airport. For the past few years, I've really noticed that it's gone downhill. It's become a complete shambles. And this is always in stark contrast to Changi Airport in Singapore, because I fly through Singapore every time I go to Australia. And this time in particular, returning to Taiwan, I had about a 6-hour stopover or layover in Singapore, and we just stayed in the airport there. Now, Changi Airport, airports are not places that you really want to spend much time in, because you want to just get to where you're going. You don't want to hang around. But as airports go, I think it's an amazing airport. They have a free cinema there. We went in there for a short while, and then they have a butterfly house. You can walk around and see all these different butterflies and so on. And they have all of these massage chairs. Every 100 meters there's a massage chair, and they have Wi-Fi, all of that sort of stuff. And they actually have an area where you can lie down in Singapore Airport. Not one of those special lounges where you have to be a member and that kind of stuff, but they actually have an area where you can rest. And they have all these other exhibits and all sorts of stuff there. As airports go, it's pretty good, and it's super clean. It's always immaculate. The bathrooms are always absolutely spotless. Now, and the staff are really good there, except for the one group of staff I really just like dealing with at Singapore airport is the Indians. I don't know what it is about the Indians at Singapore, or Indians in general. But they're really churlish, actually, and they're really unhelpful. The other people at Singapore airport are really good. And actually the Indians, they're almost inevitably on the X-ray machine or where you go through security, and they're really just sort of annoying. But the other staff at Singapore airport are extremely helpful. We had to go to another terminal. We had to figure all that out. And I hadn't even sort of got the thing out of my pocket with our details and gone over to the information desk when a guy came up to me and started asking me if I needed help and all this sort of thing. And then I told him where we needed to go, and he figured it out for us and pointed us in the right direction. That's the complete antithesis of Melbourne Airport most of the time. When we were coming into Melbourne Airport, when we arrived, someone did eventually come and sort things out, because there was this huge queue of people, because at the time that I arrived there were several other flights from Asia, several from China as well. And so there was an absolutely enormous queue of tourists from Asia, and I was thinking, oh my god, this is going to take hours to get through here. They were going up to, the staff were going up to white people, so not just Australians, but people with certain other passports as well, people from the EU and so on, and sending them to other queues that moved really quickly. But my wife went to try and find some of this stuff out, so I was waiting in the queue initially with, I was with our son. No, he was with her. And so she went off, and no one sort of said anything to her because she's Asian. And then she came back, and I said, oh no, I figured out, I know where we have to go. And, you might say, oh, well, who cares about these Asians, right? But a lot of these guys are tourists, and they spend a lot of money in Australia. And Australia seems to be trying to make money through its service sector. No one actually produces anything anymore, so it's all service sector. So tourism is a thing, and I figure that, if these people are going to come over as your guests, at least treat them well. Either that or don't bring them over to begin with, right? But they're really unhelpful for those Chinese tourists. I mean, the queue was enormous, and I always think of first impressions and last impressions. So if your first impression is that you have to stand in a queue for 2 hours before you get through passport control, it's not really going to make you particularly enamored to the place. You're not going to start off on the right foot. So after that, after having, when I figured out where we needed to go, and this guy did eventually find me and tell me, that was really quick. We went through passport control really quickly. So then we went to the baggage carousel to collect our bags. And that whole thing is always a complete shambles, because they do actually supposedly have people there who take care of the bags, but they never turn up immediately. And so all these bags, they just keep putting them on the carousel, right? And bags are getting all tangled and falling off. And there was just one random white dude in the crowd who took it upon himself to organise the bags, because he probably figured out, well, if I organise other people's bags, I'll also get my bag quicker, right? More quickly. So that guy was sort of doing that. And then, all these people around me had no idea what was going on. And there was a huge group of Indonesians near me, and they had sort of half a dozen guys and half a dozen women, and they had 400 bags between them. And the guys, half the time they were just standing around talking, and these tiny little Indonesian women were trying to grab these huge suitcases off this carousel, and they're bumping them into other people, or they couldn't do them, other people were helping them, and so on. It was a complete shambles. So finally 3 guys from the airport turned up in yellow vests and so on, fluorescent vests. So they turned up, and they were there to sort of organise these bags, because it was a complete free-for-all. And but this was 20 minutes after the bags had already started coming onto the carousel, and this other one guy had taken it upon himself to organise, or try to organise these bags. So they arrived, and an Asian guy went to ask one of them a question, and this guy the response was, no, I didn't do that, mate. And he just walked off and left this Asian guy hanging And again, I thought, all right, well, you might think, oh, so what, he's Asian, right? You don't care about those people. But again, he's going to spend money in Australia, right? He's there. He's already there, and he's going to spend money, and they want his money. Probably if he has a good time there, he'll spend more money. And then he'll go back home and tell other people, and the tourism industry will do well. Because unless you're going to do something other than tourism, if you are going to do it, then you need to do it well, right? I just thought first impressions and last impressions. And, I contrast that with when I went back to Taiwan and arrived at the airport in Taiwan. They had a dedicated guy who stood at the mouth of the chute where the bags come out onto the carousel, and his only job was to stack things, right, and organize things. And everything worked really well there. And, people in the West will talk about how we're so much more developed and advanced and civilized and organized and all of these things than Hindus or people from other parts of the world. And yet, the two Asian airports that I frequently go through in Taiwan and in Singapore are so much better organized than the airport in Melbourne. It's always a complete free-for-all. Every time I arrive, figuring out where I need to go. And I should say, after you get your bags, there's this whole thing of you have to sort of go through this bit where they check your the slips that you fill out to see if you have anything to declare, and they ask you questions, do you have any of this stuff? Because Asian people always bring in all sorts of crazy, weird foods, right? And so they always ask them, do you have any goods? And you inevitably see someone, who just has like an open packet of something, right? And they're like, no, you can't have that. You can't bring that through, because they're really paranoid, because they want to prevent all sorts of diseases and other pests coming into Australia and destroying the agriculture and horticulture and so on. So you have to join a queue to go through that bit where you potentially go through customs and where they check what you have and so on. And they never quite organise this well. The line sort of starts organised, and then it goes around the corner, and then it snakes around back behind a couple of other carousels, and then around behind something you can't see. And you can't see where that is. And the number of times I've been through there where not just this hasn't just happened to me, but I've seen lots of other people fall into this same trap. They think the queue begins in a particular place, so they go over there, and then they're told, no, it's actually over there, and you have to sort of go around a couple of corners and behind some baggage carousels, and then they figure out, and you have all these people walking across each other. It's just a complete free-for-all, basically. Again, first impressions and last impressions, right? Now, last impressions. So, going out of Tullamarine Airport in Melbourne to go back to first Singapore, then Taiwan. We got there with tons and tons of time to spare. We got there about 2.5 hours, 3 hours before our flight was due to leave. So we joined the queue, and it moved at a glacial pace, because ahead of me, I was watching each of the desks, and they only had about 4 or 5 desks open. And at every desk, this happens every time I go through there too, at every desk, there were families, and this was more pronounced with Indians, though to a lesser extent it happens with Chinese as well, where they don't just go up, hand over their passports, their tickets, or whatever, and then they put one bag on the little scale, and then they put another one on the scale, and that whole process takes 3 minutes, and then they're in and out, right? They never do that. It always takes them half an hour. In some cases, it takes half an hour, because they go up there, and there's a limit on how many bags you can have and the weight of each bag, right? And everyone knows this, right? If you're flying economy class, you can have one bag, and with Singapore Airlines, it's 30 kilograms, and then you can have a carry-on item, and I think that's 7 or 7.5 kilograms, and then you can have something like a laptop or a handbag, right? Everyone knows this, right? 3 things you can take on. 1 you can check, and 2 you can take on, right? And then you get these guys who go up there and they have 5 things, and they're not going to be able to take them through, and they know they're not going to be able to take them through, and because they've done it before, and the last time they were told, no, you can't have 5 things, right? And they still try it on every time. And you look at them and you think, are you just stupid, or are you just doing things the way you would do them in your country. And there's a reason why your country is screwed up, right? There's a reason why everyone wants to leave China, why everyone wants to leave India, because those countries are screwed up. And if you do what everyone does there and you do it here, then pretty soon Australia is just going to be like there, right? But they still try it on. I think it's so deeply ingrained in them. I don't know whether it's a genetic thing or it's just a cultural thing, but it's so deeply ingrained that you just try it on, you just try it on. And maybe it'll work. And it never does, of course. And you see these women who work at the check-in counters, and they're really patient. They have to go through this whole process of explaining, no, look, you can only take this many bags on. They have to be this weight. And yours, you have this number of bags, and they're this weight, which is, both in quantity and weight are over the limit. And, they go through this whole thing, and then they go and get a supervisor who comes and has to explain it. And, and these guys, they're just sort of dead. They're sort of very deadpan, the people trying this on. Like, they think if they just kind of stare them down, the airport staff will go, all right, okay, whatever, we'll make an exception for you. And they never will, and they never do. They still try it on. And you watch these guys, and you think, I'm going to miss my flight, because, I was here 3 hours before the flight's actually meant to leave, and I was only number 15 in the queue. I'm still going to miss my flight. What the hell's going on here? They need to, and then what they do is they say, all right, well, can you repack the bags, right? And instead of saying, right, well, just go to the back of the queue and you can start the whole process over again, right? They start unpacking the bags at the check-in counter, and, they take 10 minutes to repack the bags, and they try it again. And, they haven't actually done anything except move something from one bag to another, and they still have too much by weight and quantity of bags. So, if I move something from bag A to bag B, the problem hasn't gone away. And then they put them back on the scales, and the woman's like, no, you still have too many bags, and they're still overweight. So they go, all right, I'll try and repack them. But they're not actually throwing anything away. They're just shuffling things from one. And they do this, multiple times. And you're like, really? Really? Why don't you just send those guys to the back of the queue, right? Why don't you just say, you're an idiot, go to the back of the queue. Other people are waiting, right? But they never do. And so the whole thing is always a complete shambles, right? Every time I go through that airport. I don't know why they don't just get rid of these people. Maybe they can't. People would complain too much about their rights or something. I don't know. They seem to be able to, infringe upon everyone's rights where, when you go through the security, you have to do this whole dog and pony routine there. I don't know why they can't do it at check-in, really. And then my final experience, and there's always a final experience. One time it was all these guys trying to push in ahead of me, going through security and so on. And they never sort of have anyone kind of controlling all of that and corralling people and making sure there are enough trays and all this stuff. But my final experience this time, which I thought reflected really badly on Australia, was finally we got into the exit lounge, and they had a big set of toilets there. So I went into the toilets, and immediately upon entering the toilets, I was confronted by a huge puddle on the floor. And then everyone was sort of trying to get around this puddle, but you couldn't really because it was right in front of the urinal. So I went over and one of the urinals was broken and it was kind of full, and I wasn't sure to what extent the liquid on the floor was from the urinal or a burst pipe or whatever. But so, everyone was sort of like doing this acrobatic routine to avoid all of this as best they could, and they couldn't really. And then upon exiting the toilets, trudging all this liquid out into the area beyond with carpet. And a guy ahead of me, when I was leaving, as I was walking out, there was an Asian guy ahead of me, and he looked visibly annoyed, frustrated at the situation. And I thought, that's his last impression of Australia, right? Because he's going to get on a plane in 10 minutes. That's his last impression of Australia. But, we will talk about how we're more advanced, we're more civilized, we're more functional, all of this. And yet I've never seen anything like that at Singapore airport. I haven't even ever seen anything like that in Taiwan. And I think that, some of these issues are to do with the people who are going through the airport now, But there's also a really blasé attitude in Australia towards a lot of things, and Australia and a lot of other Western countries really have to think about this, because if they are to compete on a world stage, then they're going to need to lift their game. And that was really disappointing, seeing that kind of stuff, actually, just how shoddy a lot of things were at the airport, because they make tons of money, they suck money out of you, and yet they can't take care of those pretty low-level, basic stuff. Yeah, that was kind of a shame. So I did actually really enjoy my trip to Australia. I really enjoyed being in the countryside in particular, but those kinds of things like dealing with the airport, being in the city in general, they really rub me the wrong way now. And I can see Australia sort of, it has these surface level trappings in some ways of being really advanced and developed and desirable and so on. But I can see the threads beginning to fray at the edges, and I don't think it used to be like this as much. Maybe it's wishful thinking on my part, or rose-coloured glasses or something. But I think the threads, should I say, the threads are beginning to fray in urban Australia, and it's disappointing to me, actually. I think in the future I probably will end up living in Australia, especially because of my parents. They're getting quite old. But I do have real concerns about ever moving back to Australia. I mean, the cost of living is something, but I think to some extent I'll sort that out, and there are ways of getting around that to some extent, particularly if you live in the countryside. And I wouldn't move back unless I were financially able to do so. But the other things, there's a creeping nanny state in Australia, and it seems to get a little bit worse each time I'm there. Particularly with local governments, there are a plethora of rules and laws that need to be followed, and everyone seems to be really in favour of these things. I mean, some people complain about them a little bit here or there, but overall, people seem to be in favour of the nanny state that is creeping in Australia. And it's a weird thing, because it's this sort of anarcho-tyranny. They'll get on your case about your dog was off a leash for 2 minutes, but there's this fraying around the edges of the actual quality of life in Australia, at least in the cities. It's this weird thing where the really important things, or at least the things I consider to be important, seem to be going down the drains. But they're tightening all these rules on all sorts of incidental things. That very much troubles me, actually. And as I said, people seem to be on board with this. Even my father, who will rail against the government at times, he still falls for this. We'll be out somewhere and he'll say, "Oh my God, that person's doing that thing. We should tell them not to do that, or we should go and report them to the police or something, right? Complain about that. There's a hotline you can call or something." And I just think, really? Every time I go back, there's a particular incident, like you'll see someone talking on the phone in the car or something. Oh, they shouldn't be doing that, And in some cases, it can have an antisocial effect, but in other cases, it actually doesn't really matter. If that person's doing that thing, no one actually really cares. It's not really going to affect you. But everyone seems to be very cognizant of the fact that someone is doing something that they shouldn't be doing, or someone is getting something that they shouldn't be getting. And yes, at the same time, they're turning a blind eye to losing the quality of life and civil liberties and so on. And further to this, I'm not going to talk in depth about this, but I got a letter at my parents' house from the Australian Electoral Commission. And they actually, because compulsory voting is a thing in Australia, it's compulsory to vote. You have to be enrolled to vote. And they'll track you down, actually. I received a letter many years ago, but I moved house, so I just ignored it because I don't vote. I haven't voted since, I think, 1999. But I think they figured it out because of my driver's license, because that's registered at my parents' house. In the letter it said they've tracked me down due to some other government record. So I got this letter, and you have to enroll to vote, otherwise they enroll you to vote there. And then it's actually illegal not to vote. If you don't vote, you pay a $20 fine, and if you don't pay the $20 fine, you pay, I believe it's a $170 fine then, and then you also go to court. You may end up going to court, and you have to pay court costs. And here's the real humdinger: you may end up with a criminal record. I mean, I don't know if someone's going to deny you a job for failing to vote. But I was blown away by that when I read that, because I looked all of this up, and they actually have a thing about a section there, do I have to vote? And then they list all of these challenges in court to this, where people complained, saying I didn't like the available candidates and this sort of stuff. And they basically, to every possible challenge, they've always knocked it down. They've always said no. So you have to vote. I mean, if I were there, I would probably just not vote and just pay the $20 fine. It annoys me that you have to pay a fine for that. But so there's this sort of creeping nanny state there. And the other thing, I guess the overarching theme this time for me is the culture. The pause is everywhere and in everything. You turn on the television, you look in the newspaper, it's in every institution now. The pause, the left-wing pause, is everywhere in Australia. And this really troubles me because it's increasingly difficult to avoid these things. And it's not just what's officially there. I'll tell a very brief story, and I'll keep the details fairly light, because it was told to me by one of the people I met. So I don't want to sort of reveal too much, though he didn't reveal that much either. But nevertheless, this guy told me that his wife, I think on Facebook, had posted something right-wing or something along those lines. And one of her friends had disliked this. And so it wasn't enough to just sort of call her out on Facebook or something like that. She actually organised a big get-together for all of their mutual friends, all of the girlfriends. They all got together. She organised it with the express intent to name and shame this other friend in front of all of their friends for having right-wing views. So, the broader culture is just screwed. It's a complete mess in Australia. And I especially in the cities, everyone seems to be really obsessed with how much money they've made on paper and, new shiny things and all of this. In the meantime, their quality of life, their civil liberties, all of these sorts of things are falling off a cliff, and people are going along willingly because they're signalling and all of this sort of stuff. It's screwed. I had a really bad taste in my mouth after spending time in Melbourne each time. Other than seeing friends, I couldn't stand Melbourne actually this time, and it's really sad because it's where I grew up, and there are a lot of wonderful things about Melbourne, and I have many fond memories, but it's being destroyed, that city. I think if I ever move back to Australia, it will be to the countryside. Of course, I won't be entirely free there either if I do that, or I wouldn't be entirely free if I did that. But I guess to some extent it would be better than being in the city. And I think one of the things that people on the alt-right need to start doing, especially in a place like Australia, is networking. It was very uplifting for me to meet these other guys through my channel and talk to them and so on. And I imagine to some extent you could shield yourself from a lot of the pause, and you could maintain some grip upon sanity. But you have to avoid the broader culture and all of the deleterious effects of the city and cities in Australia. So those are my observations and reflections upon my most recent trip to Australia. Lots of good, but also lots of bad. Let me know what you think, and thank you for listening.